Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be examining the life and work of the Nobel laureate poet William Butler Yeats, with a particular focus on his interest in magic. My guest is my good friend James Tunney. He is author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, Empire of Scientism, The Dispiriting Conspiracy and Inevitable Tyranny of Scientocracy, Tech Bondage, Slavery of the Human Spirit, Human Entrance to Transhumanism, Machine Merger and the End of Humanity. He's also written 2 dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is, and his most recent book is Plantation of the Automatons. James lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a pleasure yet again to be with you.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jeffrey. I'm looking forward to a conversation.
Now, I'm very excited about our conversation today because I know many times across the 38 previous videos that we've done, Yeats has come up as an important figure for worldwide literary culture, for Irish culture, and in particular because of his prolonged and dedicated and deep interest in magic.
Well, yes, we could. One of the problems with these figures is they're so big that you don't know where to start. But by concentrating on the magic element, I think it may help some people to understand a man who was known as a poet, who won the Nobel Prize for his poetry, but also was a playwright and a novelist, and he managed a theatre as well. And he was a senator, he was a statesman, so he was very involved in a lot of issues. But sometimes this issue of his magic is forgotten or left to the side by people who are not interested in it and regard it as silly, as W.H. Auden seems to have done. But he is a major figure, and every time one digs a bit deeper, one finds some revealing fact which connects him into the story and the great narrative.
When it comes to magic, I can think of it in 2 different contexts. One would be the actual ceremonial operations of a magician, and I would summarize those by saying it's an exercise in willpower. You want to achieve a certain goal through magical will. And on the other hand, he seemed to be dedicated to a revival of the ancient Irish traditions that included a magical worldview.
Yes, a very critical link between our previous conversations, and especially about the Inklings, is the motivation for his magic and the motivation for his art. And in many senses, the magic came before the poetry, before the medium. So his magic is a critical worldview for him. Occasionally he refers to it as mysticism, but it's not, and he wouldn't make any claims to that. So he's talking about magic. And the context of origin of his magic was very clear. That what he saw was, and particularly through the person of his father, and he had arguments with his father, kind of serious rows with his father about his father's embrace of science and rationalism to the exclusion of other worldviews. And Yeats said to himself that this made it difficult for him to believe in his Christianity as it stood. Now, what he was referring to was a kind of he wasn't deeply involved in Christianity, but that was the context in which he was brought up as an Irish Protestant, no matter how low the exposure was. But this growth of rationalism and the scientific worldview after the theory of evolution made it difficult for him to continue with those perspectives and those worldviews. And he realized early on that this scientific worldview, not mere science, but scientism perhaps, was going to destroy many of the traditional worldviews. And really he set about trying to establish a new kind of universal religion, which was based on recognition of spirituality and was for him through the medium of magic. So he had bold ambitions in his mind. So in relation to magic, there's two streams. There's one, the ceremonial magic, and he was heavily into that because he wasn't very mystically inclined. He needed technique in order to help him on his journey. And the second one was about spirituality and spiritism, if you like. And here, the great figure who is the source of all the influence is Swedenborg. So Swedenborg influences him indirectly at first through figures like Honoré de Balzac, the French writer, and in particular through a book that his father had kind of read to him or told him about, which was Louis Lambert, or Louis Lambert, if you like. And this was a book that Balzac wrote in his great series when he was trying to make sense of what had happened in France after the revolution. And it's about a mystical boy who is entranced with Swedenborg. So indirectly that way Swedenborg comes in. And he's also, when we think of the Lake Isle of Innisfree, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. That poem has a number of mystical elements, but it also has similarities to On Walden Pond. So it links into the transcendentalism in the United States, which was heavily influenced by Swedenborg. And then he becomes entranced with William Blake, so that brings him back to Swedenborg again. So Swedenborg is and he's aware of what's happening in psychic research. He's aware of spiritism and Allan Kardec, and that's got a root in Swedenborg. And he does write one of the four major pieces he writes about magic was Swedenborg, Mediums and the Desolate Places in 1914. So he shows his debt to Swedenborg. But as well as that kind of spiritism, spiritualism, and ceremonial magic, there's also a realization that they had, and the Protestant gentry, or ascendancy as they call it, the upper class, the ruling class in Ireland, they realized through the translation at that stage in the 19th century, particularly by people like Standish O'Grady, I think 1878, he wrote a book on the ancient Irish heroes. It made available a literature that had been in existence from ancient times and was still in the minds of the ordinary people. And it was a revelation, because here was an ancient literature made accessible. And it was a heroic literature. So the idea of the hero becomes very important for this magician. And it's actually a base for a lot of the hero's journey. If you look back at Joseph Campbell, it's not just choice that he was influenced by. Yeats was important. And in fact, one of the ambitions that didn't come to fruition was Yeats's idea of having a kind of magical centre called the Castle of Heroes in the centre of Ireland. And this was inspired as well at a time when he was going around with Douglas Hyde, who became an Irish president. So it's not a marginal activity, but he wanted to establish a centre. And he developed the rituals. More and more information is coming out about the nature of the rituals, so we can actually get access to the initiation procedures. So it was a combination, but also he believed that the peasants, as they would have called them, or the ordinary people, had within their oral tradition a magical worldview. and was to them that he would go with Lady Gregory in the west of Ireland. His family lived between Dublin and London, but also they have family in the west of Ireland, Sligo, and he also has great contacts with Galway. And when he went to the west of Ireland, he talked to the people, and later he studied it more significantly, and that gave him access to the fairy lore. And through that connection, when he went to lecture in America, he inspired people like Evans-Wentz, who came to Ireland to study the fairy faith from Oxford and also Scotland as well, and subsequently went on to do the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So, I mean, that shows the cosmopolitan approach. He was also influenced by the visit of Mohini Chatterjee, who was a theosophist who came to Dublin in 1885, and he informed him about the nature of Indian thought, which was a central piece of the architecture of his worldview for all his life. And in fact, the last book that he did was the 10 books of the Upanishads with an Indian Swami, and they worked together on that in Majorca. So there's a number of different currents, and it indicates that it was a pragmatic worldview that incorporated a whole range of views, because he realized that they would have to fit in order to combat this force which he identified with Thomas H. Huxley and John Tyndall, who was a scientist. He's less well known these days, but he was a scientist from Ireland who was engaged in the usual suspects of study like crystallography, as we've talked about before.
Now, you mentioned Lady Gregory as being an important figure in his exploration of Irish folklore. Can you tell me anything else about her?
She's an interesting figure, and they become friendly. And he had a capacity, although some people suggest he had poor relationships with women, he had fantastic relationships with a range of women that he really respected and learned from. And when he became a senator, he advocated for women's rights at a time when Ireland was getting a bit more provincial in the context of divorce and women's right to work after they're married. He did it, and he opposed a narrow view and they should have listened to him at this stage. So he forms a very good connection with her, and she is, again, there's a very feminine element to the spirituality. He was surrounded, when he went to London as well, by a lot of very advanced esoteric spiritual practitioners who were women, and Lady Gregory gave him access to the fairy tales. There was other people of the same class who were doing so. For example, Wilde's mother in Dublin was very interested and wrote, she under the pen name Speranza, she wrote about fairy tales, and she had actually been inspired by her visits to Sweden in relation to the idea of strong female figures. So she helped him in a number of endeavours, not least giving him space at a time when he was going through unrequited love, and she also was involved in the establishment of the Irish National Theatre, which became the Abbey in 1904, that Yeats manages and uses as a platform for his own theatre and for the theatre of other people, including some of the individuals who would lead the revolution in 1916. So she was a significant figure in relation to recovering, and that's an important word, this recovery that we see in relation to Tolkien, and this act of recovery of an ancient way of thinking, an ancient worldview. And they realized as well, not only was there great wisdom there, but it was disappearing, and it would be disappearing with the kind of ripple effect from the great technological concentration in London. And the west of Ireland was in many ways an ancient society still. It was very underdeveloped, very non-industrialized, and that meant that in many ways Ireland was 300 years behind the rest of Europe. The disadvantage of that, you can say, in an economic materialist perspective, is clear, but it's not a disadvantage in a spiritual term, because the oral culture meant that they weren't spiritually impoverished like the denizens and citizens of the metropolis. But Lady Gregory was one of many women around him that was a big influence, and that this comes up again and again.
You also mentioned to me earlier that one of his first influences was an Irish mystic about whom we've done a previous interview, A.E. Russell. In fact, for viewers who are interested, I'm going to link to our earlier interview about A.E., as he was known.
Yeah. I should say, of course, that Lady Gregory was a great, did a lot of poetry herself and translations, and was a significant figure and helped in that actual endeavor. So he meets, his father followed a well-known path to penury by leaving his legal career and becoming an artist. So he didn't pursue his qualifications, and he became an artist. And art was very important in the Yeats household. His sisters were involved in printing and a number of artistic crafts activities. And John, his father, was an artist and had a studio in Dublin. So this is an important part in relation to the development of the mage or the magus, because if we put an eye in front of the mage, we have image, and image is an important part of his conception of magic. And in particular, he has a very important focus on symbols, as we can talk about. But he meets A.E. Russell at this art school, and that leads to a fairly long interaction between them around the ideas of spirituality and magic and the ancient lore of Ireland. And they're both Protestants, but they both had a deep love, affection for Ireland. And A.E. Russell directed him more to the poetry, away from being a painter, perhaps. He had an influence in that perspective. He was important for Yeats in a number, so their lives intertwined for a period. There was, in most of the endeavours that Yeats did over a period of time, A.E. Russell was there. He was involved in the theatre for a certain length of time. But one of the interesting collaborations they had was in relation to the development of a Celtic mystery school. They wanted to create an order based in Ireland, which would be a magical order with the rites and procedures that existed in other magical traditions. They wanted to restore the Hibernian mysteries, I suppose. Steiner talks about the Hibernian mysteries as being the last mysteries that existed into the modern world, and it was an important part in Steiner's worldview. So they, in the 1890s, when Yeats got involved in ceremonial magic, he had a team around him from the order he was in, and he also had access to mystics outside. And what they sought to do was to invoke and evoke ancient heroes, kings, druids, to advise them and to interact with them. So he describes going with A.E. Russell into the country, and the druids appeared before them. And in the magic of the time, there is a practice which is less well treated in the literature, whereby figures are mentally or magically projected before you. Now, this doesn't seem, it's not always purely in the mind. There's great analysis of this, but it's more, as Terje Simonsen, who you had on your program, talked in his book, it's more what's called in Norwegian a sync verving, a kind of sight twisting. So it's an idea of projection of figures before. Now that happens in magical rituals, but this is a wider concept, as well as some ability to enter into a territory. Now this would be in a mental way, where the groups of them went on a journey together into the mystic lands, back into ancient Ireland, and into the zones where they could meet figures like Angus, for example, figures like Usheen. So some of these figures that you see in his poetry were figures that they're claiming to have actually met in this magical way. So there's another level to the poetry that's maybe hard for people to understand. And when he was in London, it was he had met Samuel Mathers at the British Museum, becoming involved in magic over there. And one of the techniques that they used a lot was the invocation of mental images through the use of symbols. So there was an actual practice using cards that they call or tattvas, and they also used talismans. So these would invoke shared images, and they would use them to invoke shared images, and they would enter into the terrain. So this presents another possibility when we come to think about the Inklings, and we've talked about, and their worlds of mythopoesis. And of course, Yeats is engaging in mythopoesis. But the idea that actually there is a kind of magical invocation of a fantasy land, or a land which in some way exists or is capable of being shared. But A.E. Russell was an important collaborator who was as excited by this heroic phase, and who saw that there was a counterpoint to the kind of the dying as the stagnation within Christian culture, whereby it had been reduced to adherence to rules without any general spiritual growth, and also in a context where it could be used to polarize in an Irish context. So they were arguing always for an active spirituality, and Yeats wasn't interested in passive spirituality or even passive suffering. He wouldn't, as an editor, publish poems about the First World War that he saw as merely about passive suffering. It had to be something active that you took ownership of. So yes, A.E. Russell is an important part of many around him.
And you mentioned Samuel Mathers, who was the founder or one of the founders of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was a magical order. And I certainly want to talk about Mathers and the Golden Dawn. But actually, I understand from our previous conversation that even prior to his involvement with the Golden Dawn, he was a close associate of Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement and their inner esoteric circle.
That's right. And an important part in all this is to remember that Ireland and India are in the same constitutional arrangement in the British Empire. So there's an Indian influence in Dublin before we have the Californian influence later on. That people forget about this context. And there's a figure, Charles Johnson, who he was friendly with, and he introduced him to Theosophy at the start, and Hermeticism. So there's a Dublin Hermetic Society that Yeats is involved in. So around 1884, 1885, he's involved with Charles Johnson and with A.E. Russell in exploring Theosophy. And this becomes important. And even later on, there is when he comes back to Dublin, but in the same places that he would have studied Theosophy or learned or met about Theosophy, there is a famous story when Maud Gonne, the woman he loved, but who was unrequited love essentially, she goes off to France. She has a baby. The baby dies, and she comes back to Dublin. She's distraught, and in Dublin she asks A.E. Russell and Yeats whether the child could be reincarnated. And as a result, it's a very strange story. As a result of their conversations, she goes back to the man who fathered the first child, and they conceive a child, or she conceives a child in the place where the other child was buried, with the idea that the child would be reincarnated. A very strange view, but Theosophy was the connection, and then this London Dublin connection was very open. So it's from Theosophy and Hermeticism. So there's a Hermetic influence. But he was also interested in ghosts. He had a lifelong interest in ghosts. In 1913, as a member of the Dublin branch of the Society for Psychical Research, he does a presentation on Halloween on ghosts, and he offered himself at this period to stay in haunted houses when people were investigating them. So he was a bit of a ghost hunter. And when he comes to London, he also joins the Ghost Club, which was an earlier endeavour of psychic research before the society was set up, and it was set up, I think, in 1962, and its roots going back to the 1850s. So this this was an interesting reaction from the intelligentsia, in some senses, to the scientific worldview. But so we have his interest there in Indian philosophy in Dublin, in Irish ancient stories, ancient lore, in Hermeticism, to whatever degree it's difficult to identify, and theosophy. So he comes to London, and he joins. He meets Blavatsky as soon as he comes to London again in 1887, and he joins the Theosophical Society as part of the esoteric division. But now, despite the fact that there was adverse publicity about Blavatsky, he's impressed with her. So he believes her presence is very impressive. And this is a factor that I think people should bear in mind. There are other factors that we can't really judge unless we put them in the equation. But he doesn't stay that long with them, because he wants to do experiments. Despite the fact that he is living in a dream world, he believes that there should be empirical evidence. He believes in experimentation. He had an interest in science early on, but he left that. He didn't like this scientism. But because of that, he left, and then that leads to him joining the Golden Dawn in 1890 after a meeting with Mathers in the British Museum. And again, as we've talked about before in relation to Russell Square and the connection, he lives just off Russell Square and he goes to the British Museum. But we can see that crossroads, that clustering effect, which is important in relation to the career of a number of people, as we've talked about.
Well, the Golden Dawn was a very influential magical order. They had a series of degrees. They were, I suppose you could say, modeled to some extent on the Freemasons and on the Rosicrucians. Yes.
There's really no magical order of this period that doesn't have some connection to Freemasonry. There's a real crossover. And there still is today. It's clear, and that was no different in relation to the Golden Dawn. The sources are quite diverse, but it's in the Western magical tradition, and there's debate about the origins. There's certainly a connection to Eliphas Levi in France, who of course is inspired by Swedenborg as well. So that connection is there as well. But there's a number of trends. One of the most dominant is Kabbalah, or Christian Kabbalah, but I mean it's based on the Kabbalah as developed various stages from Spain through Italy through the Renaissance. And so when, for example, when Yeats is talking about the rose, he's often talking about a very unique symbol, a circular symbol, which has the Hebrew alphabet in 5 petals and 17 petals, and the Hebrew. You've talked before about Jane Houston, and her lectures and how important they were for you. That same philosophy underpinned the approach. So they were a very studious bunch. So they informed themselves on Kabbalah and the conception. So when we're talking about the tree, for example, in his poetry, or the symbols of the tree in his poetry, or the rose, they refer back to other things like Rosicrucianism, as you've said, although there's debates about the exact nature and there's various historical ideas. The ideas were part of the equation, but there's also astrology and alchemy. It was very, very comprehensive attempt. And of course, looking back in the Hermetic tradition to Egypt, and Egypt was an important influence on Freemasonry and the ideas in Freemasonry. And of course, it was very clear and evident in the British Museum, the links back to Egypt and the hieroglyphics and the worldview. So when we're talking about some of the symbols of birds and hawks, we can begin to think of the work by people like Massey on Egypt and the ideas of the different ideas of the soul in the Egyptian tradition. So it was really an ambitious, comprehensive attempt. On the outer order, they had to study the theory, and as they moved into the inner order, they after they were initiated, they concentrate on practical magic. Now, Yeats was always interested in practical magic, although later he develops a very comprehensive worldview. He was interested in practical magic with all the talismans and all the symbols. So the symbols that he uses in his poetry fall into a number of categories, but you can see in a kind of binary way, where we have a circular form, feminine form, and a masculine form, if you like, a phallic form, and this is a binary idea that seems to underpin his thinking, so that we have a whole load of symbols from the circle, the sun, the moon, the clock face, a stone in a circular form, or a pebble, and in relation to the equivalent of the one, we have the tower, the spear, the sword, the hourglass, and then he mixes them up later on in relation to their interaction. So we have these ideas, but these were reflecting magical implements that they would have used directly in their magical experiments. And he sought to extrapolate from these ceremonial magic when he was coming to design the Celtic orders, the mystery for the Celtic order.
Now, one of the things that the Order of the Golden Dawn is associated with, particularly in the modern imagination these days, is the notorious figure of Aleister Crowley, who was also involved in the Golden Dawn. And I gather that he and Yeats really didn't get along very well.
No, Yeats thought he was mad, and he had a sense about him. And there was a real opposition there. There seems to be an argument that Crowley was jealous of Yeats, and that when Yeats didn't appreciate his poetry, because of course we have a similar pattern in relation to Crowley, that he's a poet and a novelist and a painter and as well as a magician. So he. And of course, his name, Aleister, was a made-up reference to Scotland to emphasize his Celtic background. And later, he comes to define himself as an Irishman, although that's not true. Yeah, but the connection was important. It doesn't seem to be, at least. I mean, there's debate about some of these issues. Like Yeats thought that Blake was from an Irish background. He was convinced about that, but most people don't think that. So it comes to a head when there was a number of crises for the Order of the Golden Dawn later on in the century, and this involved a breakdown of relationships, documents being released that shouldn't have been released, secrets being disclosed, and some figures coming in and associating themselves with the order unjustifiably. So it eventually led to court cases and scandals about initiation by people that associated themselves unjustly, perhaps, with the organization. So Mathers went to Paris. He's married to Henri Bergson's sister, who Yeats had contact with as well. And Mathers sends Crowley to London to retrieve documents in 1900. And Yeats and the others don't want him to, they don't see he's entitled to them. So we had what's sometimes referred to as the Battle of Bly Road in Hammersmith, I think, where Crowley is coming with dressed up in magical garb to retrieve these documents. He had been barred from the headquarters, from the temple, and he comes, and according to the stories, he's making magical chants coming up the stairs, and Yeats is there doing equivalent chants to keep him away. And eventually he kicks him down the stairs, according to the story. And there's a case that Crowley loses. And kicking him down the stairs, in Glasgow they say, well, that's magic. They might say. But that tension was there. And it continues. There's another interesting connection. Of course, Crowley gets the Book of the Law and Telema through channeling, and this is what subsequently Yeats does when he marries in 1917. George Hyde Lees, his wife, begins to channel from divine instructors or spiritual instructors to him, and this had happened in relation to Crowley. So it was she may have had the inspiration from that previous arrangement. But the Book of the Law in 1904, for me, was anticipated to some extent in the feeling of it by a story that Yeats wrote in 1897 called The Tables of the Law. And this was about the inversion of the Ten Commandments into a dark magical force. So I wonder whether that antagonism contributed towards Crowley's particular development. There may have been a connection there. And there's another really curious connection, which is difficult to fathom. In 1916, the revolution happened, and Yeats, as many, were surprised that they had gone ahead with the rebellion. Although when he had performed the play Kathleen Ní Húlhain in 1902, Stephen Gwynne, the critic, had said, well, if you put plays like this on, you have to be prepared for people to go out and shoot each other or be shot. He understood the kind of incendiary possibilities of the theatricality, the magic of theatre, which is another form of magic, a projection onto the public. So after 1916, when Yeats writes, he waits a while to write it because it was very difficult period. He writes a poem, Easter 1916, and he's asking himself whether his words had sent people out to be shot. So whether his play and his poems had inspired these people, which no doubt some of them did, to be involved in an uprising which involved a number of poets and the signatories of the proclamation of the Irish Republic. And furthermore, he had put Cuchulainn, the ancient Irish warrior, on the stage in his plays. And again, this is a kind of invocation or an evocation of a figure that they believed was real, ontologically. So he asks himself in the poem whether Cuchulainn was with Pádraig Pearse in the General Post Office, whether actually he was there beside him, whether this figure that he had magically helped to bring back into the public consciousness was actually embodied in the spiritual rebellion, was part of it. But stranger than that, in 1915 in New York, and this is difficult to make sense of, Aleister Crowley and a group of people went out to the Statue of Liberty on a boat. They weren't allowed to land, but the purpose of that for Crowley was to proclaim an Irish Republic. And he proclaimed an Irish Republic, which was reported in the New York Times. And this was months before the actual proclamation in Dublin. So it's a very strange parallel again. And the explanation for that, we could take a long time, but it's again a thing that people should think about. The idea that public policy or the public arena is a theatrical context, that to many extent we live in a soap opera, we live in a context of projections, that image is the basis of magic, and yet we are open to images, to millions of images all the time, and we believe they don't influence us. Well, these people, the magicians, believed that they did, and not only that, they believed, or they had a sense that magical operations could constitute and contribute towards public affairs. So it's quite remarkable.
One of Yeats's most important works is a vision, and it's derived from the channeling that came through his wife. And I understand, I've looked at it. I can't say that it's easy for me to digest that kind of material, but the idea seems to be that spirit guides of some sort, working through his wife, are giving him images to use in his poetry.
Yes, just as a precursor to that, in his essay in 1901 on magic, he provides the simplest explanation for his magical worldview. And what he says was that there is a great mind, that's a great consciousness, if you like, but he calls it a great mind. And the great mind has a great memory, which in which is recorded the affairs, if you like, of history, prehistory. It's recorded in this great memory. And you could say that, he didn't say it in this one, but you could say that that's associated with the spiritus mundi or the anima mundi. And we have a mind and a memory. And our memory is linked to, or can be linked to, this great memory and great mind. So the link between the two is via the techniques and operation of symbols. So he provides a very distinct view. And now also that, and he said in that essay that minds can flow into each other. So our minds can flow into the great mind and it into us, and also that minds can communicate with each other, that can flow between each other. So in that context, he provides a simple explanation. So you have your mind, you have your memory. The memory is also constituted by ancient elements. It links in, and it can link into the older or the existing great memory and great mind. So what the magician is doing, what the mystical person is doing, is establishing better communication with those forces. Now, into this, you could see the daemon figure, or I think the figure that, or the equivalent that Blake uses is the genius, your poetic genius. The daemon could be the conduit between those things. They could be the means on which you communicate. One symbol that's very important for Yeats is the idea of the mask. So the mask becomes important. The rose in the 1890s, and he moves on to the mask. And the mask, we can trace that back through the magical literature, through the ancient literature. The mask is often used by a magician. It's used for a number of purposes, not least if they're engaging in astral travel so that they will appear differently. But Yeats sees it as a technique that enables you to develop your anti-self. So in many senses, Yeats is a precursor of what Carl Jung later writes about. And a lot of his interest in symbols, his interest in mass, his interest in equivalent to the anima and the animus, it kind of anticipates a lot of what Jung is doing. But instead of having the kind of dark side and a dark self, Yeats has the anti-self, which means different things in his complex vision, but it often means the elements of you that you don't have, the things that you need. So instead of looking inside at your bad bits, it's an idea that you can expand your good bits, or you can accommodate other things, as far as I can see. So the mask was often a device as well to contact with your daemon. Now, what the daemon is varies. There's two different constructions, at least, we could put on it. We can well, there's a number, there's three. One, we can see it as our subconscious, or as the collective unconscious, or accessing those elements in a Jungian sense. And if we go back in the as we've talked about before with Surawardi and the Persian tradition and Korban, we have the man of light, the person of light as well, the double. Now, Steiner says that in the Council of Constantinople in 889 that the Catholic Church abolished the spirit. There used to be a two-spirit doctrine. There was the soul and there was the spirit. And he claims, it's subject to interpretation, that used to be there in the early Christian tradition, but it was taken away. So there's this idea that we have our spiritual body as well. So the daemon could be just that. But there is also the sense that the daemon is the historical, or could be historical figures that are attracted to you, either sometimes because they're different from you, or they are instructors. So there's this idea of instruction. There is a strong idea that comes up in the literature in various contexts of a cosmic classroom. People often experience this when they're asleep. They feel like they're being instructed, and they come up with information that they couldn't have had through other sources. It's noetic kind of instruction. So what it is unclear. All those possibilities are there, but it's a muse, a source of inspiration. Sometimes he's dealing with these instructors at a higher level. Sometimes he's dealing with his daemons. Sometimes he's dealing with particular spiritual guides like Leo Africanus, who used to come through in seances. He was very interested in seances. He attended seances regularly, and through that he had figures that came and dialogued with him. Some of them particular figures, and some of them important. So from his simple explanation of magic, through other works like, as we talked about, Swedenborg, that essay, and also another work which is Per Amica Silentia Lunae, he comes to the vision in 1927, and by now he had won the Nobel Prize. So I think in his head he probably thought he was a great scientist as well. So he sets up a very comprehensive and difficult system, which revolves around phases of the moon, 28 phases with particular characteristics, highly astrologically astute, which indicates patterns in the human psyche, in world history. He helps him to look at the phases of world history, to advocate a theory, to suggest that we're coming to the end of an era, that the Christian era is over, that history, the psyche, the great mind works in accordance with certain principles. And in this is one key symbol which has to be mentioned, is the gyre, or gyre if you like. And this is, if you like, a spire, a cone, or a spiral. And this idea is important to remember if you're ever reading his poetry. He had this idea that a lot of the world can be explained by one force which starts off and spirals and expands to its outmost limits, and at the end another figure spirals back. So there are natural phases of things where they contract and expand and contract and expand. So the sea, it's like the yin and yang. It can work repeatedly like a DNA sequence. It works in relation to cycles of history. So it can lead to a certain fatalistic view where you believe something has expanded too much and it's going to contract. So it ties in with some of the ideas of Nietzsche, who had some influence on him, and also to Spengler. But it's an interesting idea that he uses, and it's also related to a fundamental idea associated with the heart. The heart is one of the recurrent symbols that he has in his literature, and he's referring to the physical heart, but more importantly, he's referring to the mystical heart, even the sacred heart. And the movement of the heart, as we know in a lot of the traditions, is consistent with the idea of the universe, that we're moving from a contraction and expansion, and the blood flowing through it. So this idea of activity and repose is a fundamental idea, a dual kind of interaction with some other substance that appears in it. So the vision should be seen as a comprehensive development with his cosmic instructors, of his simpler worldviews. But although a lot of people have not made a lot of his comprehensive system, it may happen that it will be revisited and reinterpreted and simplified for the future. But it certainly draws on a lot of ancient mystical literature, and there are insights that one can come to in different ways. It's curiously quasi-scientific or mechanistic in its worldview. But what he meant by it was that we really had to attune ourselves into the natural world, into the cycles of the moon, into the subjective and objective interactions. He saw the moon and sun as having different functions through our connections with the planets and the universe. So there's an element of a medieval worldview, or a worldview that Paracelsus might have recognized. And again, I think one should approach the vision with a kind of open-minded, kind of fluid approach, and not get too hung up on it, but look for the insights that are there. And he used it to provide a way to look at historical figures or historical phases. And it may provide insights if one approaches it with a kind of poetic looseness.
Well, I would imagine that for probably most of our viewers, they've heard the name of William Butler Yeats, but he's sort of one of those dusty old white male figures of literary history. What is his relevance today? What can we say about his influence on our lives?
And no, that's no country for old men. A lot of the phrases we hear around us go back to Yeats. People would be surprised at the extent to which he's quoted. He's out of copyright now, so it's easy for people to reproduce him. He's been turned into songs, but what he is doing is starting this tradition of recognition of the force of the technical society, the technocratic society, the technological society. He sees the deadly effect of modernism. He becomes friendly with William Fletcher Barrett in Dublin, who had worked with John Tyndall in his laboratory, and he came to Dublin and he engaged in your business. In parapsychology and investigation of paranormal activities and psychical research, and Yeats knew him. And that was part of a reaction to the overextensive claims of science and scientism and imperial scientism. Yeats saw that straight away, and through his wide, magical, poetic view, what he's saying is that the imagination is the most important thing. So the imagination, therefore, it fits in with the impetus and the intent of the Inklings. It fits in with William Blake, who he worked on, he edited William Blake's poems when he goes to London when he was a young man, and they discovered some poems that had been forgotten about. So he's very important as a proponent of William Blake's view. So William Blake, of course, is the great proponent of the imagination, as is Swedenborg. He was also influenced by Burma. He was also very influenced by the Greeks, by the Neoplatonists, by Plato, by the pre-Socratic philosophers like Empedocles, who gave him some of the ideas about the Gaia. So what he provides is a channel to a continuous pattern of resistance against unduly narrow perception of the world. And in the book Louis Lambert by Balzac, the student, who is obviously a representative or a reflection of Balzac himself, he's kind of bullied at school, and they call him poet and Pythagoras, which doesn't seem that bad, but they were referring to the fact that the boy was getting interested in ancient Greek and a bigger worldview, and Yeats would have been interested in that as well. He was influenced by Oscar Wilde as well, who he knew. Through his activities, anticipating the Inklings. He was involved in the Rhymers Club at the Old Cheshire Cheese in London, and he was trying to mobilize the artistic movements, for example, of symbolism and decadence, towards his religion. So what he's doing through his whole life is saying that the ancient traditions are relevant. They're fundamentally important to the development of human consciousness, and that we have been fooled by the idea of what he called a sentimentalist. So he believed that a person who lived in the sense world and didn't see anything else was a sentimentalist, with the implication there of an undue concentration on feeling to the exclusion of anything else. Now, he concentrated that with, if you like, the poet or the person who lived in reality. So the person who engaged in the real world with a capital R, they were engaging in reality. So the other people were misled. And if we look at, he provides a choice to us. He provides and points to an enchanted, meaningful world, in contrast to a nihilistic world dominated by scientism, which leads to disenchantment and disillusionment. And another person who didn't appreciate Yeats to some extent and was Samuel Beckett, although he came from the same class. And it strikes me that, well, Samuel Beckett was an interest, and he went through a psychoanalyst in the Tavistock Clinic, again near Russell Square, and met Jung on that early on. So he had great issues and portrays in many sense a kind of nihilistic worldview. And when you come to compare the work of William Butler Yeats to the work of Samuel Beckett, who I like in other respects, but if you look at Waiting for Godot, the more I think about it in relation to where he came from, in relationship to Yeats, is that Waiting for Godot is a representation of his spiritual world in some senses. It has curious resonances with the world that Yeats described, equivalent to the Bardo plane, that the person who hasn't engaged with their spirit, who hasn't engaged in the spiritual world, can find themselves lost and a husk of themselves in the next world, not knowing where they are. And as I was reading his descriptions recently of the afterlife, he wrote a lot about moving on to the next plane and what happens, which reminded me sometimes about Arthur, your mentor, Arthur M. Young. There is some similarities in relation to the description of descent into being and escape, and there's right angles there as well. But to some extent, the vision presented by Beckett is a bleak vision, which is meaningless, with vague kind of humor in it. And it mirrors what Yeats is describing as the world of people who are lost in the next dimension. It struck me very forcefully when you look at some of the comments by Beckett on the spiritual worldview and that kind of existentialism in France that he was mixed up in or had connections with. That really he is describing a spiritual world as well, and a spiritual world on the next plane. So why he is relevant is he provides, through his deep psychological explorations, a sense of what Lewis would have called a deeper magic. It's deeper than the dark magic. And this is a magic associated with knowing yourself on a deeper level, and about knowing if you believe in reincarnation, the incarnations you have been in before, of getting access to the embedded consciousness that is inscribed in your own consciousness, and making sense of the archetypes. He has a whole range of symbols for archetypes, from the fool, the beggar, the king, that appear in his work, again anticipating to some extent the work of Jung. And he provides in it a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at yourself, which is magnanimous and exploratory and cosmopolitan. And in it, he is capable of seeing his relationships in a mythic way, for example. I mean, his relationship with Maud Gonne, looking from outside, is it looks, he persists in asking in her hand for marriage, even when it's clear she's not going to marry him. But he sees that, he would see that in a mythic context, in relation to ancient legends, in parallels in relation to ancient legends, and he would see connections with Mother Ireland, with the goddess, whatever. So he could see there was different levels to it. And even with the dark side and the things that didn't work out, he was able to transform them. He was able to alchemically transmute them. So he begins to provide and indicate strategies of the imagination to cope with daily life, to derive meaning from daily life, to make sense of grand events, to deal with grand events. So his insights provide deep psychological intuition that is reflected in his poetry, that can speak to people, and probably speak in ways, because of their focus on symbols, that transcend the particularity of the context, if we open ourselves up to them. He also provides a way, I've suggested and we've talked about before, I think that in future, to deal with the great forces of concentrated technological development, that there will have to be unity between the different traditions at a higher level. And he was open to learning from all the different traditions and to integrating them and to provide mechanisms and structures to be able to respect them, as well as respecting the poetic genius of all the particular peoples and looking at them. So he's extremely meaningful. There are critics of him for his later stage because of his flirtation in the 30s or disposition to a kind of quasi-fascism before he realized what it was. And one thing that is difficult to explain is he had an interest in eugenics later on, but I think they were mistaken directions. Nobody's perfect. It does tie into some sense of a sense of elitism, which he certainly had, but it doesn't take away from. And he saw then that all the big idea, whether it was communism or fascism or an over-dominant church, they would take away the human imagination. Now, if you look at people that have interpreted Yeats, like William Irvin Thompson, who you've met, I believe, he talked about, he was interested, he did a PhD on Easter 1916 on the revolution, and he spoke and wrote about the vision, but he emphasized the needs to be careful about institutions and to reflect on the institution of the individual. So Yeats is emphasizing the power and magnificence of the human imagination and the institution of the individual. And his father, in fact, when he was asked about William Butler Yeats's education, said that the most important thing, and he used this word, was that he developed his sovereignty. So he actually used that word about William Butler Yeats. So that idea of individual sovereignty, which fits into other traditions, which doesn't dismiss the wisdom of the past, which doesn't get so entranced with the immediate and the moment that it forgets itself, is an important part. So he's deeply relevant. People will find, if they flick through his work, it's so available now, all the plays, all the poems. Even if you're a pauper, you can get access to poetry, and your mind can be a palace, as they say. So he's deeply relevant to people. You'll find words or phrases, and some of these have a hint of gold about them. They have a hint of magic, of real magic about them. And the real magic that Jung talked about dug up from the dark mud of the subconscious and brought to light so that the gold can be revealed. There's a lot of that, a lot of ability to touch into ancient wisdom across the traditions, bringing the best from Kabbalah and Judaism and the history there, and Christianity, and through his interest in the Arab world, and it's really a model for that operates on a worldwide context that I think he will remain relevant over the next century.
I know he's had a big influence on my friend Whitley Strieber.
I remember he recited the poem when he talked to you, and he did it very well. And for him, it was a key for him and his wife. It was a key context in their life and afterwards. And there is a parallel, I think, some inspiration there in his life, perhaps in the opening up of his consciousness to the other worlds. And Whitley Strieber as well, identifies the importance of that heritage, which Kathleen Raine described it very well. She was very interested, the poet, and she was very interested in Yeats, and the way she's talked about Byzantium, which is the city of the imagination that Yeats sees, like Blake sees Jerusalem. She said that she wasn't Irish, but she was part of the Ireland of the imagination. And as Ireland goes through a massive transformation that I'd never thought I'd see, towards materiality, towards a changing from its ancient culture to a modern culture, which is economically cosmopolitan, but rootless in many senses, or in two senses, phonetically, then that will be lost in many senses. But what will remain out of that, and will be perhaps more accessible in an international context, is this channeling of what was a holy and special place through the imagination, Ireland of the imagination, whereby the connections, I would feel connections to people who weren't from Ireland, who engaged in the deep model that it provides in relation to understanding the world, in relation to the similar thing, the universal imagination of humankind. And it doesn't matter, and these figures show that it didn't matter whether it came from Kabbalah, whether it came from the Arab world, whether it came from India, that people who are open to universal truths can present you with universal truths. You don't know where they're going to come from. So Whitley Strieber subscribes, as far as I can see, to the Ireland of the imagination. And he is a living example of someone where the poetry provides a very direct and meaningful connection to his wife, as far as I remember, in a different space. And this revivifies the world by showing us that the ghosts at the window pane, to describe another thing that Yeats wrote about, or he saw the ghosts in a kind of double of humans when they're having, on the breath, when they're having wine. Our world is enchanted with things that we don't understand, but all the traditions tell us that exist. And the people that have maintained the integrity of the human imagination, who have been open, I think point the way forward to providing the contrary force to balance the over-concentration left brain on the technological society.
Well, I see right over your shoulder, our viewers who have been with us for the past hour or more have seen this image of Yeats that you yourself have painted. And I'm pretty sure, since you're a poet yourself, you find inspiration as well in his poetry.
I do absolutely. And it's not only that, it's that sometimes you have to concentrate on figures, on their life, in order to get a sense of themselves. And I found that very useful when I'm painting, for example. I reproduced Rembrandt's self-portrait. And when you do so, the figure can actually come alive. You begin to notice things, which is quite remarkable. Like, for example, Rembrandt noticed that he's cold, and he was in a cold time. And that led me on a particular path. It comes true when you're painting, but the figures can come true when you're doing that, and it makes you think about them or empathize with them. I was thinking about Yeats as the young magician and what it meant to him and what it was. And curiously, what struck me when I was doing that was, and when you look at some of the older pictures, was the resemblance between him and the face and Harry Potter. So the Harry Potter figure, who is the modern magician for a lot of people with the round glasses and the dark hair, of course, when they're casting, they look back at models for what a magician might look like. And I wonder, I've seen no evidence, but accidentally, consciously or unconsciously, they seem to have produced a kind of reflection of the young Yeats. And I was asking myself, well, what image would be coming to mind by him? And the figure that came to mind was an Irish figure called Monument MacLear, which is associated with the sea. So my sense was that there was something, he would have been preoccupied with something associated with the sea. That was what, if you like, came up, and there was sort of have a representation of that figure. And then recently they were showing pictures of nuclear weapons being detonated in the west of Ireland and waves engulfing Ireland, and it kind of prefigured in a way some of the senses that, or some of the ancient stories Colm Kill talked about, well, the sea in Ireland. But the symbols and figures are an active part of your own imagination. So you can look and say, okay, that's him talking about his unrequited love and the rose, and okay, but really the point of them being there is so we can awaken our own consciousness about these things, about look at what they meant by a tree, for example. The power of the symbol of the tree is remarkable, as we've seen in relation to Tolkien, as we've seen in relation to Blake, who talked about art being the tree of life and science being the tree of death. That's what, for him, the two trees. These things are relevant. Looking at the lives of people who have focused on art, on contributing something, on contributing meaning, and the adherence and respect for people who are endeavouring to help us with meaning provides us with resources and resilience that we all need in a world which seeks to demean us and to mean existence and to reduce existence and to dispirit us. So once you get dispirited, or once you have meaning stripped out of your consciousness, or once it's reduced or denied or inflated, well, then it becomes difficult for people to actually enthusiastically and joyfully engage in the world. So yes, I look at these figures for inspiration too, because you have to, as C.S. Lewis said, to read. He reads so he knows he's not alone. It's identification with people that have similar concerns, that express their vulnerabilities, that express things about the passage of time. He wrote a lot about age, and I suppose the good news for older people, although he talked about an old man and a tattered coat upon a stick, the point was that as one gets older, the soul sings more, and it's not defined by its physicality. And it's an important point in relation to our spiritual development, that some of the things we think about are don't work that way in the spiritual world, and that in the spiritual world, that some of the things we are preoccupied will be burned away. A lot of the movement in the next life is to get rid of things that we shouldn't carry or we can't carry to a higher plane. So yes, I think these figures can be used, as he explained, in relation to symbols, and as Jung would have explained, to activate our consciousness, to activate our vision. Vision is a critical thing, to be able to see. So even for William Fletcher Barrett, he made discoveries about the eye and developed a machine to look at his own cataracts and examine his eye. It's about seeing. A vision is about seeing, but the seeing that they're talking about on a higher level is the spiritual eyes, the eyes that can see beyond, that can, remote viewing is another aspect involved. And these are all things that are inherent in the human consciousness. So, yes, I would recommend that if people are beginning to look at some of these figures, they're referring to symbols that they should actively engage with. So you read the poem about the rose, well, begin to understand that this is a deep philosophical and mystical thing that can actually operate on your consciousness, not just on your mind, not just in compartmentalizing them in a left brain. They can actually work as figures or symbols or initiators to, and you talked about self-initiation. Art, in many senses, is involved in the initiation into a different worldview, to break out of the shell of the limitations of part of your brain that seeks to particularly be influenced by the external world that wants to project a limiting view on human consciousness. So yeah, I find certain figures very inspirational, and I go back to them and I use them. I think that's really the thing. You interact with them, and you play with the figures, you use them, you reflect on them, and you will get something back because they were seeking to give something.
Well, in closing, James, is there a favorite poem of Yeats that you would like to share with us?
I could recite a few poems, but I think in a lot of the poetry work, people come back to a few recurrent poems, and they become familiar to people. And the poem that came to mind when I was the one that it just came to mind. I don't know why, but it was a poem called "The Two Trees," and if you don't mind, I'll read it to you. It comes in two parts, just to kind of anticipate it, maybe a bit useful. There's two parts: there's a bright side and then a dark side, and the trees. Again, I've referred to what they may mean, but of course, in the Golden Dawn, and that the tree of life was there, and the grades were associated with rising up the Sephira, and Yeats's vision was of energy coming down through the Sephira, through the tree of life, and rising up. You had to rise back up through it, and that was the same, a magical idea. So we had Blake's Two Trees as well, art and science, or scientism, as opposed to good the good science. So that's in it, and he talks about the glass, and I just want you to think about the glass and gazing at the glass. So gazing at the glass, of course, refers to a mirror, and a mirror is an important symbol. But because of the persistence of the symbol in time, I think the glass today refers to the screen, to television, to mobile phones, to the black mirror, to scrying, whatever. And I really think it's relevant in that context. So gazing at the glass, I think, is it was prophetic in relation to think about it. And again, it's a mystical thing. So there's different levels. So he's talking about to his beloved, but the beloved could be I see it as his daughter in this context. And I am struck. It's a thing that even in my lifetime, Jeffrey, for young women, the way that technology and the media have made young women and young men now obsessed with their appearance in a very deleterious way. It's a kind of a crippling thing associated with corporate desires to sell products and marketing, but it's a deadly disease. And in this, all of these again, and boys and girls are developing masks to hide their themselves. And really, the important thing is what's behind it is the tree of life in them, the spiritual tree, their spiritual capacity, and that's a context in which it comes. Okay, it's called The Two Trees. Beloved, gaze in thine own heart. The holy tree is growing there. From joy the holy branches start, and all the trembling flowers they bear. The changing colours of its fruit have dowered the stars with merry light. The surety of its hidden root has planted quiet in the night. The shaking of its lofty head, leafy head, has given the waves their melody, and made my lips and music wed, murmuring a wizard's song for thee. There the loves a circle go, the flaming circle of our days, gyring, spiring to and fro in those great ignorant leafy ways, remembering all that shaken hair, and how the winged sandals dart, thine eyes grow full of tender care. Beloved, gaze in thine own heart. Gaze no more in the bitter glass. The demons with their subtle guile lift up before us when they pass. Or only gaze a little while, for there a fatal image grows that the stormy night receives, roots half hidden under snows, broken boughs and blackened leaves. For all things turn to barrenness in the dim glass the demons hold, the glass of outer weariness, made when God slept in times of old. There through the broken branches go the ravens of unresting thought, flying, crying to and fro, cruel claw and hungry throat, or else they stand and sniff the wind and shake their ragged wings. Alas, thy tender eyes grow all unkind. Gaze no more in the bitter glass.
James Tunney, once again, a very thought-provoking and delightful conversation. It's been an enormous pleasure to be with you and to probe into the life of this very seminal poet.
Again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your inputs and your contributions to this discourse. And you've got honorary citizenship of Ireland of the imagination, Jeffrey, for your work, for your work in bringing some of these figures to a wider public consciousness through our conversations.
Well, it's an honor for me to be able to share you with the New Thinking Aloud audience, James. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us. The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website